Um, Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. My name is Mushiri Nyaga from the Local Development Research Institute. It's based in Nairobi, Kenya. On behalf of the Data for Development Network, welcome to this uh, final session of the third series of the State of Open Data Tables, and also the penultimate um, penultimate session. No pressure, team. No pressure. Uh, it's been a journey of working to update chapters to the State of Open Data report. This is a report that was initially developed in 2018 and published into the following year. The report can be found online, and we've been holding roundtables with authors of the various chapters just to discuss what has happened since the first edition of the State of Open Data report was done. A lot has happened since, obviously, across the thematic areas that that are covered in the report, and the Open Data roundtables have taken those discussions at a thematic level and at a geographical level. And today's session, this last session, is a bit of a global perspective, an overall view of what we are seeing. And this session is hosted by Tim Davies, who was very central to the first edition. Tim, you are lead author, right? On the first edition. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So feel free to mark our work and on these updates of the chapter. Delighted to have you. So Tim is going to chair this session with his panelists. He's going to introduce the panelists to us as we get started. And I'm sure that you're going to find this fascinating session as much as we are all looking forward to it. Over to you, Tim.
Fantastic. Thank you, Machiri, for the welcome, and thank you to all of you for joining us. So I'm going to put some slides up to take us through some of this first section. As you'll have seen, we're being recorded. When we get to discussion, we'll invite participants in the room to also unmute and come on screen if you wish, or use the chat function to share your thoughts, reflections, and questions. We've got this session happening in 5 parts, some quick introductions. Then Renata and I will share some reflections on the overall state of open data collection. As Machiri mentioned, I was involved in putting together the previous edition and book, but on this edition, I've come in just to work on a few chapters and have the real privilege of working on the introduction and conclusion. So it's been a real chance to come fresh to some of this work and thinking and reflect on where we've come and where we still have to go. So we'll present a brief bit of that, no more than 10 minutes. Then we've got some fantastic panelists here with us, Lorraine, Alec, and Jenna, bringing different perspectives from work, both in the open data field, but also intersecting and outside the open data field to kind of critique, question, extend some of the thinking we have. Then there'll be the floor open for your questions, and then we'll wrap up. Now, it's always tricky with panelists such as these to give their biographies in any clear way, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to very briefly introduce themselves and share with us one thing that represents the current state of open data for them. And while they're doing that, I'd also invite anyone else who wants to share their own reflections on that question in the chat feature. So maybe Renata, I could come to you first.
Yes, so I'm Renata Avila. I am the CEO of the Open Knowledge Foundation, an international organization and also a network of different chapters in different countries. And I would say that how to encapsulate is something, a phrase that we are using at the Open Knowledge Foundation, that is better together than alone. We cannot see open data as this isolated issue anymore, and we cannot see open data not only isolated from social issues, economic issues, financial issues, and all the complexity of our world, but we cannot also not isolate it in one single stakeholder. So we are seeing the emerging power of data when it is a piece, a component of a larger machine in the digital society that is enabling and is empowering, and when you put all these pieces together is when the magic happens.
Fantastic. Maybe Lorraine can come to you.
Isolated in one single stakeholder. So we are seeing emerging.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Lorraine Frasiuncula. I am the executive director of the Davies Initiative, a nonprofit foundation based in Switzerland. And for me, Tim, I would love to. I think open data is in a state right now where we're coming at an inflection point to rethink what we mean by open data as well, and what data represents in the society. So I would say that it's not only about open data, but about the power of data to unlock different values in the society, in the economy. And it's about going beyond the dichotomy between open and closed, and thinking what exists in the middle as well, in terms of what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve with that data. So our mission at the Davies Initiative is to build agile frameworks to responsibly unlock the value of data for all. So I would love to see the conversation of open data also moving in that direction, about thinking how can we unlock that value for everyone, and how can we do that in a way that is responsible.
Fantastic. And the power of data, that's been a real theme, Jenna, I think, in work you've been involved in. So maybe I'll come to you next.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone. And building on the themes here, because those are some of the reflections I had, is that the one thing that strikes me is that we have and are moving on from this open or closed, or share or hoard kind of a dichotomy. And I think the way I like how Lorraine put it about unlocking the value of data, but what I'd like to add on to that in terms of my reflection, I think the discussion has moved to questions around stewardship. So how do we steward data in a way that allows us to unlock that value? And stewarding data responsibly the endpoint of that might not be completely open, right? But it will enable all kinds of positive benefits. And I think that the stewardship concept is very helpful, because it pertains to a range of ways in which data it's a more nuanced way of understanding a few key things. One is how can and should data be sort of managed on a day-to-day basis. The next is a question around responsibility and ethics. And so stewardship, I think, can encompass those considerations and brings that into the discussion. I think that stewardship is also a helpful way of thinking about how to enable greater transparency and participation in data governance or decision-making around data. And so by having a kind of thoughtful stewardship, then we can think about being more transparent about how data is used, again, without necessarily needing always, in all circumstances, to make the data itself fully open, because that may not be possible or desirable. It allows us to think about incentives and sustainable data sharing. So effective stewardship thinks about how different stakeholders, what they get out of sharing or not sharing that data, and some of these questions around business models for sustained data sharing, et cetera. And lastly, thinking about stewardship opens up a discussion around the technical standards and interoperability and other questions that are needed in the technical space to facilitate the unlocking of that data. So I actually sort of equated this concept of stewardship with that, how do we get to this goal of unlocking data for social benefit or for all? And I think that we're no longer in a space where the question is open, but it's about how to steward.
Fantastic. And I segued so smoothly that I forgot to get your introduction to who you are and where you're based, Jenna. So maybe you could briefly do that.
Oh, my bad. I'm Jenna Slowden. I'm the Senior Director of Policy for the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and I'm based in New York.
And that leaves Alec. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alek Tarkowski. I'm the Director of Strategy at Open Future. We're a European think tank for the digital commons. I'm based in Warsaw, Poland, Eastern Europe. It's interesting. I, for a moment, scrambled to find something else to talk about than what I planned to talk, listening to Lorraine and Jenna, because I'll be just a bit repetitive, but I'll try to show a different angle. And I think this is interesting that we're aligning. That's some sign of a strong trend. But the way I would frame it, this trend that you're describing, there's also an inherent risk at it for open data. I want to say that I, in the past, have been involved with really pushing for an open data strategy in Poland. I remember my first global open data day years ago. So I see this as a movement and as an approach that really by now has a history, but I've also been involved in the last year in at least European data governance debates. And in these debates, openness has by some been sidelined. It just doesn't appear. So people here are saying, if you rightly, that there's a spectrum. In many debates, that spectrum cuts off somewhere just before open. And you can find conversations where people are really starting to raise a lot of challenges. And I would frame this as an issue that needs to be addressed by open data. Our take at Open Future is that it is indeed a spectrum where really open data is still a very strong value proposal, which is very powerful, very empowering. And I think in this sort of current mindset, collective mindset, we need to make sure this sort of empowering proposal approach is visible. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. So that tees us up wonderfully to get into our look at what's come up in the many chapters of the State of Open Data, some of which the updated chapters are already available, others are upcoming. So I'm going to try and go through some of the observations and then Renata on the conclusions. While we're doing that, there's still that question for audience participants of your reflections on that opening question. But let me share some of the headlines, observations on the global state. Really, there is that idea, delivering on the ideal that data, critical resource of modern society, should be widely available, structured and shared to all without restrictions on reuse. Delivering that ideal has been a long struggle. Alec mentioned like 10, 15 years of work. It has roots even earlier on. And it's been a struggle that's involved thousands upon thousands of different individuals, organizations and communities. And without the efforts of those communities, right now, public procurement would be more opaque, smart cities more proprietary, transport systems less integrated, and pandemic responses less rapid. We mustn't forget those successes and progresses that have come. And across numerous initiatives, open data ideas have become more and more embedded as a way to support accountability, enable collaboration, and unlock the value of data. But much like the climber reaching the top of the foothills and seeing the hard climb of the mountain ahead coming into view, open data advocates, architects, and community builders have by no means reached the end of their struggles. And in 2023, we see across the collection that action on open data faces some new and significant challenges to ensure the future is one in which open and generative data infrastructures and ecosystems are embedded in a norm rather than a patchwork of exceptions, in a sense to keep that open end on the spectrum rather than see it cut off. So building open infrastructures that could power social change in the next century is no small task, and meeting the challenges ahead needs lots of the learning from the last 15 years of the open data movements. And in the collection that's been put together, we find some of that learning, because we do see, I think, unlike maybe 5 years ago, a real maturing of the movement that situates open data very clearly within that broader set of debates that Lorraine and Jenna and others have pointed to. In 2021, the World Development Report had the theme of data for better lives, calling for a new social contract for data. The UN Global Partnership on Sustainable Development Data have launched their Data Values Manifesto, demanding a fair data future. And you find open data ideas as central elements, not the central element, but a central element in these. And even in the chapter on statistics, Shada Baidi reflects how early on statistical agencies rejected open data as a norm. They've now broadly embraced those principles. But at the same time, there are other parts of the data movements that have a more equivocal relationship to this idea of openness, encouraging maybe a softening of open data binaries that we might engage with positively, focusing on when and how open data contributes to data justice, indigenous data sovereignty, or the sharing and use of data for the public good, effectively raising that question of where should we draw the line? Should we push only for openness in that binary, or should we recognize those places midway, and how to do that in a way that's constructive? And at the same time, across the articles in the updated collection, we see a significant dissatisfaction with the pace of change. We can't deny the uncomfortable truth that many of the authors remain really concerned that the full potential of open data has not yet been realized, nor is it on track to be met soon. There is promise that is still there within many of these open data ideas and that remains relevant today and yet is not fully realized. And we see articles painting a picture of quite limited progress in the last 5 years and many warning of backsliding on basic commitments to data publication and use. And some might argue that's because the promise of open data was always overhyped. But we do see many of our authors remaining hopeful that open data can still deliver substantial impact. Instead, with that maturing movement, they diagnose a number of key barriers. Firstly, an under-attentiveness to the power dynamics of data, an underinvestment in data infrastructures, continued gaps in the provision, quality, and relevance of infrastructural data sets, tensions around data privacy and ethics, and vitally, I think, a lack of emphasis on the collaborative relationships needed to build effective data ecosystems. So the learning is there on how to meet the challenges, but it's often not as equally distributed or shared or embedded as it needs to be. And it raises a key question of whether the open data field, insofar as that still exists in a coherent sense, is learning, adapting, and embedding practice fast enough and with strong enough foundations to resist threats to openness, which do come from a range of spaces. We see authors talking about closing civic space and growing global instability that sees data sets that were hard won disappearing from the open web and disappearing from view. We see the growing prominence of extractive AI firms taking advantage of the paradox of open to build their power on open knowledge at the expense of community empowerment and open generativity that open data was meant to support. And we see an increasingly unsustainable distinction between personal and non-personal data and the rise of data sovereignty policies regulating data flows and limiting cross-border flow. But for all this changing landscape and these emerging challenges, perhaps the most commonly cited threat to open data across the collection is simply underinvestment, because the value of open data infrastructure and ecosystems still can't be neatly captured as a flow of revenue in annual accounts. Authors note that funding open data efforts really still remains challenging. And even in cases of those, that progress with stats authorities, without backing that with resources to maintain and, as Jen said, steward data effectively, many aspects of open infrastructure that have been prototyped and started to become embedded could still wither. And so there is a challenge for communities around open data in the future. The first edition of the book used the 5 international open data conferences between 2010 and 2018 to kind of structure the narrative. And there hasn't been an international open data conference since then, or an open knowledge festival, partly pandemic disruption, partly shifting funder priorities, and alternative data agendas, fora, and events filling the calendar. But as articles in the collection and the webinars that State of Open Data project's been convening over recent days highlight, there is a real variety, varied extent to which we can say there is currently an active community, and that raises questions for the future of the open data movement. So there are a lot of the articles say there is real value in cross-country collaboration, interaction between national and international and regional organizations, between civil society and governments. But as this is playing out in particular sectors, we need to ask, is an open data movement still relevant, or is it sectoral? And how do we have one that addresses not the problems of intellectual property enclosure that we faced in the early 2000s, but looks at the problems of data power that we're confronting now and in the decade ahead? And on that note, I'm going to hand to Renata for some reflections on potential ways forward.
Thank you, Tim. And one of the reflections, that when you were mentioning that, and one of the reasons to remain positive, I guess, is the grassroots level of intergenerational change that it's happening. At the Open Knowledge Foundation, we host the Open Data Day, and we're amazed, of seeing people in their teens and 20s applying to host one of these events, and a lot of vibrant grassroots communities starting in many countries in the Global South to experiment and play and be agents of this, and having a more like, this year we hosted something on around AI and openness, and being like, like able, not as it was like, like 10, 15 years ago, even explaining what metadata was a challenge. And now what I'm seeing, like just adding to your comments, what we are seeing is a far more prepared civil society, far more prepared citizens, actually, in understanding the complexities of this topic and being able to unpack it and associate it to aspects in their daily life. But yes, but what our ambitions and our dreams, and even the public discourse of leaders and the public sector and the social sector, it falls short when we look at the investment. And one of the areas of improvement, and one of the key areas of improvement that this report leaves us, like it's across all the areas that we have been exploring, is the need of strategic investment on data, the infrastructure that you need for data. I mean, there's the cliche phrase of data is the new oil, but what we are missing is all the pipes and the engineers and all the components needed to extract the public interest value of this. And when we look, for example, how much a government, even a small under-resourced government, invests, like just in a highway, a tiny little highway in the middle of nowhere, compared to the totality of funds invested in the data infrastructure of a nation, it is incredible to see like the mismatch. Each and every government and each and every, like, even public interest, big groups are discussing about the power of digital, the power of data, the power of open data in this case. And it is a complete mismatch between discourse and the investment. And I think that this report is the perfect invitation of a more bold and concrete demand of not only sustained but substantial increase in funds available for matching the ambitions that we are like preaching about our data futures. So strategic investment in key areas is essential. But just an example, for a group of environmental activists, or even just for a Ministry of Environmental Issues, to be able to have a solid strategy to tackle climate change, the investment to unlock the data that is closed or to produce that the data is missing is massive. But the potential benefits of it can like really impact our future as civilization. The other is the stakeholder roles. As I was saying, like the positive note that citizens today seem more prepared than ever to be able to understand the value, respond to the value in a more interactive way, and contribute to the discussion. But it's no longer the hackathon. It's no longer the dynamic of civil society 20 years ago. Like now, the role of civil society is moving to a more critical role and a more like a protective role of the mission of the open data movement. Like civil society in its role is more vigilant, and it is alert at open washing or at things that might not be open, that are sold as open. And it does not necessarily need to understand all the technicalities of how data is, doesn't need to make the complex creations with data, because that's the role usually of academia, private sector and public sector exceptionally. What we see as well is that public sector is more and more developing capacities and understanding on the value of open data, and also taking a critical role on the way that a private sector is taking advantage sometimes like really contributing to or potentially contributing to this ecosystem that we are hoping to grow. And the last thing is that we are like moving slowly to a rights frame, meaning that we are moving to a situation where it's not only the technical discussions about data and the standards and so on, but we are moving to a more sophisticated conversation on rights. And slowly, the open data world that used to be like a very technical one and only limited to discussion on accessibility and standards is moving slowly to critical discussions on rights, and not only individual rights such as privacy, but also collective rights and critical conversations around extractivism, exploitation, or sophisticated conversations on how to take advantage of big open data pools as a source of benefits and sustainability for communities. And I guess that we will see in the next 5 years a lot of innovation around it. So to wrap up, to meet the ambitions that this report reflects, we need considerably a considerable increase of investment. The second thing, to understand that the role of each stakeholder has evolved, and that the role of civil society actually has evolved to be a more vigilant and more like a holding the movement accountable kind of role. And the third is that we have to seize the opportunity of these sophisticated conversations around rights to make the open data contribution meaningful for the social rights and individual rights sectors that we are seeking to advance through it.
Thanks, Renata. So we've given you that overview of what we found in the report, and I was going to invite our panel now to come in with a first round of reflections over the next 5 or 6 minutes. And I gave them the prompt of taking those findings or recommendations and either challenging those with no, but we need to think about, or extending them, because that's the preliminary conclusion and introduction you've heard. We're still drafting it, so these comments will feed into the final draft as well. So I don't know if anyone would like to kick that off, or Jenna, maybe could I come to you first?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to come in with a yes, but. So yes, indeed, I think that the sort of movement and community is maturing, as is the kind of broader data for development field, et cetera. But my question is open data really under threat? Or are the barriers that are very thoughtfully pointed out indicative of an increasing complexity of the landscape we find ourselves in? And like we're more and more and more into the territory of wicked problems, effectively. And as such, and given this complexity, what I think it really brings to the fore, some of the barriers and points that are articulated, including around this like attention to rights and these questions of power that have emerged, suggests that the ways in which this complexity, the ways in which we sort of collectively as an open data movement, a broader data community, the digital community needs to engage is on questions of governance at very high kind of levels of legislation and high kind of levels of like global governance, regional governance, national, but also a very grassroots kind of engagement in decision-making kind of governance. And so you see, I think that I wonder what the reason I call it a yes, but is that if the perception is that open is kind of under threat, then it's sort of address these barriers. But if instead you reframe to a kind of question of like, how do we grapple with this complexity and these wicked problems, what that introduces is the notion that it's a series of very difficult trade-offs that emerge, questions emerge, depending on who the stakeholders are in a given setting, what the specific topic is you're talking about. And it really reflects what Renata was saying about moving out of this like exclusively technical space into a much more sort of socio-political set of issues that require, for which there are no right answers. effectively. And that's where I think attention to the multifaceted issue of data governance needs to come much more prominently to the fore, and where then it becomes possible to address the question of who holds power, who doesn't, who benefits and who doesn't, and because those actors are set up as adversaries. And instead, how do we find workable solutions that mediate different incentives and interests of stakeholders around where kind of, and then can align around an ultimate goal of unlocking sort of data for social benefit. So I'll leave it at that as a first stop.
That's a fantastic opening. Maybe Alec, could I come to you next? Or Lorraine? Lorraine's ready to jump in, so go to you, Lorraine.
Oh, sorry. You can. I just wanted to react to what Jenna said, because and build on that on my reflection. I want to say yes, and to Jenna, and maybe no, perhaps to one of the recommendations as well. And for me, it's the focus on rights, and I wonder if it wouldn't be too limiting to say that the reframing should be exclusively on rights, because I think it leads us too much, although I think Renata correctly said it's not only about individual rights, it's also about collective rights. I think it risks not encapsulating that dimension which Jenna mentioned on stewardship as well, which for me goes more into the realm of responsibilities. I think all stakeholders have responsibilities when we're thinking about the ecosystem of data. So it's not only I am sort of passive and I have this right that needs to be protected, but I have responsibility also over the different kind of risks that I am exposed to when I am in a digital space, for example. And for me, it's very much around thinking how we can move for a position of unlocking that value in a responsible way, and how can we make sure that this is present for all stakeholders involved in this ecosystem. And it's about how, in building what Jenna said, thinking about the governance mechanisms of that, and that's what we're calling it in the data sphere as agile mechanisms, which can be either perceived as technical approaches, such as different privacy enhancing technologies that really are a game changer for sharing data, but also how can we think about agile mechanisms from a governance perspective, from a bottom up, where data sharing communities can come together and decide on what are the best mechanisms to share and unlock that value of data, but also how we can think about that from the relations between different communities with other communities or groups of users with different organizations that are collecting data. And another reflection that I would have is yes, which is the matter of funding. And I love the anecdotes that Renata brought in terms of the disproportion of how much is spent with infrastructure in a small country, and how much it's not spent around the data, which can be understood also as a critical infrastructure for development. And so funding is a key bottleneck. It's something that we see in the different conversations that we have with stakeholders everywhere. And the scenario is even more grim when you think about the fact that in the digital space overall, this funding is just decreasing, and there is no really in the near future signs that this is going to increase. So we need to think about different incentives, and we need to shape the narrative to make sure that it's not only a technical issue, it's not an issue that only concerns the data people or the digital people, but everyone else, because it is a broader societal problem.
So over to you, Alec.
Yes, so I'll try to build on that. I want to start by remarking how in the end, it's fascinating that we're talking so much about rights. Again, going back to my past experiences, I remember how strongly the conversation about data reuse was basically rooted in economic ideas, right? It was all about strengthening the market. And I still remember I did a like an expert report for the Polish government where their only goal was to find out what percentage of how much the GDP will grow. So in that way, it's great. I'm saying this as a social activist. But I think on the other hand, and the other thing I want to say, it was always about reuse, right? The challenge was, okay, we can put the data out there. We could already have a repository, and is anyone going to use it? We knew for some data sets, they obviously will, like I know classical cases, weather data and geo data will get used. Others, less certain. We are now living in a year or maybe a decade where reuse is a done deal due to AI training. You put any data on the internet in reasonably structured format, you know you're part of a great experiment and reuse at planetary scale going into billions. Again, some huge, I think, transformation. So it's very good we're having the right discussions there. My take is I think there's a lot of these conversations that go sort of beyond open, and I think they fairly raise questions. I'm happy that the issues of power imbalances are raised here. We have this frame at Open Future. We speak about the paradox of open, where we try to have exactly these conversations. How do we acknowledge these power issues? But in this conversation, I somehow feel I want to defend a bit this well-tested and sort of foundations of open data, because I think there's a lot to build on. My main thought is I've been also following all the conversations, which I frame as the data intermediary conversations. They're fascinating. They build models that are rights-based and potentially very, very sort of sophisticated in striking that balance, right, between protecting rights and getting data to be used. But here and now, at least in Europe, they're really a niche. So we have great academic conversations about data intermediaries, data cooperatives, but when you look in practice, their scale is very small. I do believe they require, and that's a separate conversation, exactly the same support as open data. They require a strategic investment, they require capacity building. But I would say from that perspective, it is open data that is an approach that has the infrastructure, has some understanding in the society, has different capacities. So I think it would be great to think in this yes and mode that this is this community that can lead in many ways in developing these models. I know it might, again, I'm happy about these comments. I think, for instance, often when open data starts to be treated, and I know this from experience, for instance, by public administration, is largely a technical issues of having, a repository working. It's probably hard to go to them and say, well, you need to reconsider the foundations of it. But I think that would be my proposition going forward, that I think we try to work, acknowledge these challenges to open, but also think, how do we build on it?
Fantastic. So we're going to come to another comment from Jenna, to Renata for some reflections, and then we're going to be opening to questions from the floor. So if you've got questions brewing, either put them in the chat or use the raise hand button in Zoom. But Jenna, I think you were going to come in on investment.
Yeah, I did just sort of have another yes and on investment. And I thought it was great that on the slide about investment, you had that like crazy picture of the roads, and you made the comparison to like physical versus hard or data, open data infrastructure. And I think here, where where a useful kind of concrete action is around really penetrating the space on digital public infrastructure that seems to have really exploded, not just in a kind of amongst the data geeks of the world, but in spaces like the G20 and elsewhere, where countries like India are really foregrounding their experience and trying to share that with the world. And there's this like funny silo happening right now where there are all these folks who are talking about digital public infrastructure and all these folks who are talking about data, and they're like not talking about the connections between, which seems a little bit absurd. to me. And so I think there were a few useful arguments to be made. Some of you might have seen that last fall, September, we commissioned Dahlberg Development Advisors to do an investment case and have a kind of headline figure of every dollar invested in data systems. On average, you get a $32 economic return. And that's a useful headline for certain types of funders, and goes to your point, Alec, about the Polish government being concerned about the GDP increase. But that piece also speaks about the social returns to investing in data systems. It speaks about the environmental returns, and it speaks about institutional returns. So I think there's a lot more there when we can think holistically about returns on investment and why this matters. But it also, and some of the thinking also thinks about or tries to articulate and recognizes that in a highly constrained financing environment, an argument can be made for thinking about what is the proportion of investment that should go to data systems, data infrastructure, data capacities across all kind of sectoral investment, whether you're thinking about official development assistance or the kind of domestic investments of a given government. And this also, I think, holds for domestic investments on budget in developed countries, because I think that like no one's really that far ahead. And so, it's sort of a recognition that we need to stop building for one-off projects, and we need to make these investments in the pipes and the systems, which is not just about kind of technical, but it's also about capacity, and it's about governance and the ways in which not just the legal infrastructure, but the spaces are created for civil society and citizen engagement, and ways of thinking, not just about like your consent architecture for individuals, but also those questions of collective rights and collective harms. And so there's like a whole way of thinking about the return on investment and a kind of cross-cutting percent allocation that hopefully gets us to much more strategic investments.
Fantastic. Renata.
Yes, so I just wanted to had a quick comment on the openness at risk. And I have an example of one of our communities, the Open Knowledge chapter in Russia. One of the very interesting things that we have been monitoring since the war started was Russia used to have a big commitment to open data. And it had like very nice and efficient portals, real-time information being shared, excellent work from the technical and the civil society communities over there. And that was one of the first casualties of the war, actually, like immediately the portals going down, immediately, evaporating it, shutting down. And it is a trend that is followed. I mean, as we move in a more multipolar world, one thing that would be terrible is that if the concept of openness and open data and interoperability and global initiatives becomes just one group of labeled, Western countries flag, and we lose all the struggle that we had of years and years of civil society connecting the dots and North and South working together. In the early days we had like Brazil working side by side with the US, with Europe, and so on. And we are at risk of losing it if it becomes an issue of identify of just a group of countries and a way of seeing the world. And I think that we need to dimension that. We need to dimension the geopolitics in this situation and how we need to remain, supportive of and connected with a truly global movement. And I think that that's something that will take a lot of work in spaces like this one and with reports like the one that is being published. And we should remain vigilant to preserve and to enable and to keep connected these different sectors, groups, and countries, and not leave entire parts of the world isolated because of the geopolitics at the highest levels that we are seeing. And the other thing that quickly, we have seen the absolute value of open data if we think like the tragedy of the earthquake in Turkey, for example, and how open data sets can actually lead to rapid responses, lead to fixes in infrastructure, and save a lot of lives beyond just the usual applications of mobility and things that we are more exposed to. It can still and has the potential to lead to incredible not only economic benefits, as Jenna was saying, but incredible benefits in saving human lives. And that's absolutely inspiring. We have the ability to do much more than in the past. And I guess that more people with the skills to do far more in the civil society and academia side, that are increasingly working more hand in hand, as we have seen in the report. Yeah.
So I think we've not yet got some questions coming on chat, so maybe I want to reflect on a theme and then throw that to the panel of this tension perhaps between openness under threat or openness in need of nuance. And the thing I'm reflecting on from everything that's been said is we need to tell the difference between when there's a case where openness needs new nuance, and actually the way to solve the problem that we set out to solve is to recognize this is a governance problem, this needs structure, this needs systems, this needs collaborations. And that theme really came out through some of the chapters of saying, yes, we did the open bit, but we didn't spend enough time on the partnerships, the collaboration, the community building, the governance building. We need to do that now. And other cases where there are genuine threats to openness because it is the best solution to the particular challenge we face, but it's also a solution that makes certain powerful actors uncomfortable, whether that's in the geopolitical context Renata reflected on, or cases of opening up corporate registries in privacy respecting, but also power unveiling ways that are increasingly under threat and seeing kind of pushbacks. And maybe we need a better way to map when the creative tension of open data advocates pushing for open data, and picking up on Mike Mora's point in chat of do we need an open data movement? Do we need to make the case for one? My own sense is often you do need that creative tension of those who are saying we're pushing for an open default, but we'll accept nuance, rather than solutioning in a space where either new forms of enclosure or just forms of caution and kind of, in a sense, bureaucratic cautiousness lead us to plan out something that's a bit more controlled, less generative, less collaborative than it could be, where openness pulls us in that direction. But to try and put that in a question for the panel, and this is one I shared with you in advance, was if we do have some of these communities and movements or groups focused on open data, where would you like to see them putting their energy and emphasis over the next 5 years to kind of support the agendas that you're each working on? Where does this fit within this broader data landscape that we're now part of? And I don't know if anyone wants to take that first. Alec.
I can go first with possibly what sounds like a fringe interest, but I'll explain why I think it's important. So I'm really keen for this movement to explore the issue of business to government data sharing. And again, I don't know whether when you hear that sounds, yeah, it makes sense, or wow, that's a very different issue. And it's actually you, Tim, who in one of the conversations really pointed out that at the outset of the open sort of data mission, there was also a lot of talk that corporate data should be open. And obviously it's happening to some extent, but I think it's fair to say that not really a lot. In Europe, we just faced legislation in the Data Act, which made not a very progressive proposal to introduce these rules. To cut the story short, basically only as emergency measures. So I don't know, really something terrible happens, data is needed, there's a pandemic, you have to release it immediately and then use it to do something good and then delete it. Not a very structural approach. We, as Open Future, advocated for a stronger approach. We called it public data commons, based basically on this idea that you should have a public interest body that can get private data. And what we learned from this advocacy effort, which faced a lot of struggles and probably will not have a very broad such horizontal approach, though in some sectors like health it will be happening. And this is what I want to focus on. There's, of course, business doesn't like this idea, but also there's distrust towards the state. And obviously, in some parts of the world, this distrust, I think, is a very fair issue. I myself am based in a country where, as a social activist, I have many problems with the rule of law in my country. But I find that there's an argument that maybe should be addressed by other measures. And I think this general distrust goes beyond that, and also is typical in countries that really shouldn't face, are not facing so many challenges. And I think it's a challenge for us, because I think it would make the open data model a lot stronger. Not the model, but the ecosystem. It really was fueled also by private data. And we don't need to look far. Again, I'm coming back to the whole crazy AI development happening around us. Basically, what people are saying, we want to see the corporate data, right? There's no better case than the one you can find in the news today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'll come for a brief comment from Renata and then to Jenna.
Yes, and that leads us to thinking the infrastructures, the institutional infrastructures of the future that we need, the new institutions and the repurposing of institutions that we currently have. Like, what is the role of UNESCO? You know, what is the role? Do we need a different entity with an international mandate to deal with this? Are we are the current standards bodies democratic enough to deliver the governance that we are hoping? What else is needed so we can transcend the national state and have this government, like the public sector to private sector to public sector sharing of data that goes beyond borders and across sectors. And I think that's so many questions of the future. We have the unprecedented investment in green technologies that is happening right now, and we didn't develop a strategy in parallel to really, squeeze the juice of the data value that will be generated by many small and medium sized enterprises that are benefiting from these funds in Europe, for example. That was a beautiful opportunity to create high value data sets on a key sector, and key sectors such as energy. So I think that we need to be thinking on this architecture, institutional architecture in parallel, and revisit the mandates of institutions that we already have, to update them and maybe retask them, repurpose them with a more focused mission on what is needed now.
I'll come to Jenna.
Sorry, I put my hand down, but I didn't come off mute. A reaction to your question, Tim, that sort of responds also, Renata, to something you said. I agree very much with you when there, and I loved how you framed that, Tim, as like, when is there like a really serious threat, and when do we see these geopolitical dynamics and other social phenomena of a general like kind of rightward shift in society globally, not just in the United States where I'm sitting, but really like in all around the world, where we see these really challenging actions. And you asked Tim, sort of how and where does the sort of open data community fit into that, or how does, and my initial instinct, and perhaps this is because I'm not like an open data native, like I don't have the same sort of history in that movement that many others on this call have. But my thought is that those circumstances with serious, challenging geopolitical dynamics and social dynamics, with misinformation, with the rise of fascism, etc., are broader social phenomena that touch data and digital and information questions, but not only. And therefore, the strategy should be to find the partners that you join in terms of advocacy, in terms of political influencing, in terms of identifying entry points, rather than having a kind of like a sort of open data advocacy. And I'm drawing very bright lines just for the sake of, I'm not suggesting that anyone actually said that, but I think that the new strategy should be one that's about joining forces with other movements that are concerned with these trends for a range of reasons, and bringing the data and information piece into that discussion rather than sort of chipping away at it alone. So that's my kind of response on that. And I think that they're very important factors. I did want to also kind of, I think it's interesting, Alec, that you raised the kind of business to government. We just had a peer exchange yesterday on accessing privately held data, but it was all focused around trust, and particularly the trust that public sector institutions do and don't have vis-a-vis the private sector, like whether they trust each other, and whether the general public trust public institutions to be able to access that data from business and reuse it. And how do you establish and build that trust? So it's not new to say that trust is needed, but the question is, what are the really concrete and actionable ways that that trust can be built and maintained? And how do we learn from different experiences on that? And I think that that also is some of that mushy stuff that needs more attention. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. And I've often described like the rise of open data as a temporary alliance between lots of quite different interests that came together on open licensing. And really what we're seeing in this discussion is new alliances needing to be formed to deal with the challenges we face today. Lorraine, in a few moments or a minute or so, can I come to you?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And yes, to new alliances. I think it's all about expanding from the small circle of people that are concerned about data to the broader concerns around digital, as Jenna said, but also to other sectors. And I want to double down on what Alex said around business to government and say that I would also love this community to work on business to business data. And that's why I keep pushing on the point on it's beyond just open data, because that can scare off a lot of businesses when they say just opening all this corporate data, proprietary data that has a lot of industrial secret in it. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we are working specifically on building agile ways to share data between different parties, and we're calling this project modular charters for data sharing communities, because it is exactly that, trying to come up with the governance mechanisms to allow businesses to share data with themselves, using privacy enhancing technologies, and actually get the value extracted from this data without necessarily having access to the entire data set itself. And the case that we are working on is exactly in building what Renata said on CO2 emission data sharing, responding to the requests or for the legislation around Scope 3 emissions in Europe, of course, coming from the COP, and to say, well, there is this requirement for you to share data. How can we make sure that you share data with each other and really are able to report on Scope 3 emissions without breaking any kind of industrial secrets? And I think this is it can seem like a very niche case, but I think it can provide an illustration on how we can really break through this polarization of open versus closed, or just private versus sort of a government data. Because for me, the response is going to be a bit in the middle, and I'm afraid, and how some conversations end up going related to stewardship, even when the focus is too much on centralization of data. And that's also, to add to what Jenna said, in a lot of countries, public institutions do not have the trust of businesses and citizens. In a lot of parts of the world, that's true. So relying solely on statistical offices as stewards of data, or even to a broader international organization to do that steward, to be that steward, I think it would be somehow limiting the options that we have at hand. I don't see it as a silver bullet, just centralizing it as a solution. So I would love to see an experiment with alternatives and decentralized alternatives that actually we can see where they end up going. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from if we allow those communities to experiment with this data sharing in a way that is responsible, and that if we can draw lessons from this as well, in a way that provides alternative to just centralizing and increasing risks of sharing data.
Thanks, Lorraine. Sadly, we've come to the end of the hour we'd put for this conversation, but there's so many starts to themes to go deeper into. So if you'll allow me, I'd like to just ask our panelists for 30 seconds of closing thought, but particularly I've asked them to think about any invitations to where we continue this conversation, or where these conversations are continuing in the year ahead as the State of Open Data Collection comes out, and we could take that forward. So maybe reverse of what we've just done, if I can come to you first, Lorraine.
Thank you. And it's great that I start this off, because I forgot to mention something when I was making my point on experimentation. I think that's a nice segue to the closing. We will be bringing together experts, practitioners, and companies on a global forum on cross-border sandboxes for data. And this is exactly the goal, is to provide a place where we can share good practices in terms of experimentation for data sharing across border. And I think that's an important gap that is not being addressed anywhere else. So interested parties, people that want to talk about it, it's very niche, but I'm sure that within this community that we're talking to, I can find other people that are interested in engaging this exercise. So I'm open for continue that conversation, and now I'll share information on how you can reach me in the chat.
Thank you. Jenna?
Yeah, one suggestion of a concrete opportunity this year and next, and this is just one venue, it's not certainly the only place, is the development of a global digital compact, which the UN Secretary General has called for and will be sort of approved and unveiled at the Summit for the Future in 2024. And so there's an ongoing process of consultation this year, and then member state representatives at the UN in New York will be negotiating the language of that compact in 2024. And I think that's a really important entry point for where this sort of data and digital concerns come into play, and speaks to some of my points about kind of joining forces with other, because it is a broader agenda than just these topics. But if these topics around open data, around governance, around the complexity, and some of what the others have said are not well addressed there, that I feel is like the game in town from a global governance perspective. And I don't want to also put too much stock in it, right? These things are not binding, we can criticize them, but it is the kind of center of gravity in the global governance space. And I think it's an important one to engage with and keep an eye on.
Fantastic. Alec?
I need to unmute. I've been signaling on this call that I have an interest in seeing the connections between data governance and AI governance. So along these lines, we're really keen to understand commons-based governance of AI data sets. And I think I don't need to explain that there's a lot of room there, both to explore what it means that open data is used in these data sets, but also bring all the thinking and practices. That's one thing. And the other, I really like this idea of connecting this space. I think, Jenna, you mentioned it with the discussions about digital public infrastructure. We need to treat data as an infrastructure. It's happening, but it's still in two silos. Places where these connections can be made, I think that's great work, because I also think that, for instance, in Europe, we're really seeing quite a lot of support for the idea of digital public infrastructure. And if with this support, we can also build capacity for open data, that would be wonderful. Because it's, I should mention, there's very strong open source component there. So again, pretty clear how these connect, especially to shout out to civil data engineers.
Last one to that, certainly. Renata?
Mine is around openness. And at the Open Knowledge Foundation, we are like reopening the open definition discussion to to offer a platform to discuss all these questions about openness. How open? What's open? It needs to be open. Why open? And who's benefiting from it? And so the Open Definition Forum is reopened. And we are like gathering there a broader group to rethink the concept, validate it if we are still happy with it, update it if we are not happy with it, and then apply it to the realities of the digital realities of today and to the future. So I guess that we will be at all these venues that you have mentioned discussing it. And I guess that this open State of Open Data report will really, really shape and feed the conversations that we will have around it during this year.
And I failed to unmute for the last time. So that thank you to all. There's no more for me to do than to thank our panel for stimulating those discussions. Thank people who've been engaging either live or on the recording, and just share on screen that d4d.net is where you will find the original edition of the State of Open Data. If you scroll down the State of Open Data pages there, you'll find pre-release kind of blog post versions of lots of the chapters that are coming. And towards the end of May or in early June, I believe you'll find the whole new collection along with the introduction and conclusion from Renata and myself, which will be greatly enriched and updated and I think refined based on some of our discussions today. So thank you to you all, and also to the Data for Development team for convening and putting this together, Fiona and Kezia and Machiri and others who've been behind the scenes for this whole series. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.